I believe in a world of global justice in which everyone is heard. To this end, my work has carried me from courts to villages around the world. But it was an experience in Malawi that taught me about the power of women's voices in global justice. I was there representing a man on his criminal appeal, and after visiting him in a suffocating cement cell, upon his request, I went to visit his village to speak with the elders there. I remember crouching beneath cloudy skies in the dirt as a sign of respect to his parents, who were standing in the doorway of their hut. A crowd was beginning to gather quietly behind me when all of a sudden the parents stepped into their home and closed the door. Pivoting on my knees, I turned to face the crowd and saw that in each of their hands was a stone. I froze and then looked up at them. In their faces was utter terror, and suddenly I too was terrified. Everything in me went numb, and I found myself voiceless. The crowd then looked to their left, and following their gaze, I saw walking down the hill whom I could only imagine was the village chief. For a moment, I was distracted from what seemed to be my imminent death because, I'm embarrassed to admit, I was surprised by the fact that this chief was a woman. She beckoned for me to return to her hut, and as I stood before her, she asked me to explain myself, my story, and my client's story. This was a deeply transformative moment for me because up to this point, I struggled to be heard before powerful men in times of conflict within my family. These men showed me the power of using my voice, but I had to fight for it. Whereas this chief, who was the first female justice I had ever met, showed me another model by creating space for my voice. And I began to see how powerful this model could be on a global level. With this chief, I shared my story and my client's story, and then she shared her community's story and their fear of my presence in their village. By asking one another questions to get a full picture of the facts, we reached a common understanding and realized we were not threats to one another's security. It was then that the chief decided that my death sentence would not be in the interest of justice. This chief showed me the power of women to uphold justice by creating space for our voices. Because without this space, I learned, we cannot advocate for our own humanity. This is why my mission is to carve out more space in global justice for women, because we are appallingly underrepresented. And because when half the world's population is not being heard, our shared pursuit of global justice will fail. But my other reason for this mission is because despite our underrepresentation, I've seen just how powerful our voices are when we fight for them anyway. Women must be included in all areas of international law because our laws affect all of us. But our underrepresentation is particularly concerning because of how we're being actively silenced in today's conflicts. Systematic sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war to target female civilians. It is not only silencing women, it is wiping out entire communities by controlling their reproduction through raping, impregnating, and sterilizing women. This weapon of war is on the rise. According to the United Nations, in Rwanda's genocide in 1994, over 250,000 women and girls were raped in a matter of 3 months. In today's ongoing conflict in the Congo, over 200,000 women and girls have been raped. ISIS has sought to destroy the Yazidis, a religious minority community in northern Iraq, by enslaving, raping, and forcibly marrying thousands of women and girls. Since last August, Myanmar armed forces have used systematic gang rape as part of its ethnic cleansing campaign against Rohingya Muslims. And in Syria, systematic violence is being used as warfare, torture, terrorism. I could go on, but we'd be here all day, and you'd leave feeling desensitized and hopeless. And while that may seem like that's what I'm doing right now, that's not, ultimately why I'm here. The reason why women are often the first targets of extremists is because of the central role we play in so many families and communities. Through sex trafficking, slavery, and extortion, extremists achieve security objectives by displacing civilians from strategic areas, and they benefit financially. In 1 year, ISIS extorted between $35 and $45 million from the Yazidis alone. For centuries, we didn't have international laws prohibiting wartime sexual violence. Our laws prohibited us from torturing one another, but not from raping one another. And we accepted this because we believed that raping civilians was an inevitable byproduct of war. Only recently has this begun to change. In the 1990s, we created UN tribunals and the International Criminal Court, which found in several landmark cases that grave sexual violence amounted to international atrocity crimes, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. What these cases show is that our international community no longer tolerates sexual violence. We now recognize our human right to be free of this violence and have access to justice. Let me be very clear. This change only started happening once women became leaders in global justice, as judges, lawyers, and survivors of sexual violence. And what's amazing is that in a world in which their voices are underrepresented, they have been fighting for our collective voices. At the same time, they have been fighting for their own. Now, this talk has been hard, and it's about to get harder before it gets better. But first, it's important that we understand what the leadership looks like at these international courts, because it's an important part of the story. At the UN tribunals, out of a total of 33 judges at the Cambodia Tribunal, which is holding accountable Khmer Rouge leaders responsible for the genocide, 6 have been women. That's 18%. We see comparable gender gaps at our other tribunals. But it's even worse at most of our permanent courts and gets as low as 3.8% at the International Court of Justice, which has been around for 73 years. Out of 106 judges, 4 have been women. I mean, that's just crazy. At the International Criminal Court, where I once worked, it's 35%, better, right? But even at this court, which actively advocates for more female judges, we see our numbers dropping because countries are not nominating enough women. None of these courts come even close to hitting 50%. We see this disparity not just among judges, but lawyers too. At the International Criminal Court, 26% of lawyers are women. International courts are the face of global justice. Female voices shape our court's perception of atrocity crimes and our world's perception of fairness and equality. So how do we, women and girls, increase our leadership in this field? Like the leaders before us, we start by asserting the power of our own voice. How do you tap into this power, though, when your voice is being actively silenced? The women and girls I've met in the field are showing us how. I represent a young woman who fled persecution in El Salvador to seek asylum here in the States. She shared with me how the M18 gang hunted her down, beat her with guns, repeatedly raped her, and then told her they would kill her because she's transgender. This happened twice. She went to the police, who did nothing. She sought help from a friend who said if she spoke again, she'd lose her head. But she did speak again. And as she shared with me her story and her scars, I saw in her eyes courage, because she believes in her humanity and in the power of her voice to make others see it too. Another young woman who is showing us the way forward is Ikhlas. In August of 2014, along with thousands of other Yazidis, Ikhlas was kidnapped by ISIS. She was 14. After being torn apart from her mother and seeing her father killed before her eyes, Ikhlas was held in sexual slavery for 6 months. She was bought and sold, and every day she was raped. She tried taking her own life 4 times and failed. She tried escaping 3 times and failed. On her 4th attempt, she finally escaped. This is happening in our world. Today, ACLA speaks out publicly to put a face to this violence so that it doesn't happen to other women and girls around the world. Together, with the power of these girls' voices, we are fighting against this weapon of war. We are fighting for our rights. And we are creating more space and global justice for women and girls to be heard. And you can expand this space even further. We need you. We need you as judges, lawyers, experts, such as statisticians who can stand up right here and give us more up-to-date numbers. We need you as investigators, witnesses, law enforcement. You name it, we need you. And we need you as sisters, mothers, lovers, to fight the very violence that aims to silence us in war zones, workplaces, and homes around the world. We need you because when we step into leadership, we enact powerful change. Under Judge Pillai's leadership, the Rwanda Tribunal found that rape was an act of genocide, in a case where she was the only female judge. Judge Pillai recognized that the evidence being presented about sexual violence amounted to a level of gravity, not recognized by even the prosecutors. Judge Odio Benito at the former Yugoslavia Tribunal paved the way in defining rape as torture. A little over a year ago, there was a historic case at the International Criminal Court. It was historic because the court found that rape was a war crime and a crime against humanity. It was also historic because all of the trial judges were women. So too was the prosecutor. The reason these leaders enact powerful change is because they not only recognize our humanity, but they know to ask the right questions to determine when crimes have been committed against it and when to hold people accountable. We can also learn from leaders like ACLAS, who has spoken before US Congress, UK Parliament, and the UN, calling on our global community to do better. And incredibly, we are finally starting to listen. US Congress and UK Parliament have taken the position that ISIS committed genocide against the Yazidis. And just last year, the UN passed an initiative to start collecting evidence of atrocity crimes in Iraq. We live in turbulent times where global justice needs you now to uphold our universal human values. So I ask you, women and girls, to exercise the power of your voice and your leadership whenever you can, because we cannot build our global humanity without you.